It's fitting somehow to be speaking about this subject of mind-body unity. That's the subject tonight, mind-body unity in relation to education and health, because John Dewey is so closely associated with Teachers College, and the subject of mind-body unity is so close to John Dewey. So, one thing John Dewey said about mind-body unity is that we almost can't even speak about it in a very accurate way, because our language is so imbued with dualistic ways of thinking about it. I mean, we don't even have language for we have to use words with slashes, etc. Psychophysical. There is no adequate language, and because of this, it's very hard to describe. And I've spent many years searching for ways to describe and capture some of the experiences and some of the insights I've had, because again, our language isn't suited to it. For many people, mind-body unity means something like an interaction between mind and body. For instance, we say, well, I wasn't feeling, I was upset and it affected my body, or I carried tension in my shoulders. And we use that kind of language to describe how one system affects another. And in fact, that's how I thought about it for a long time, until it dawned on me that mind-body unity actually addresses a much more fundamental educational problem, namely how the human system, the human organism works in action, and how to make that more conscious, which, as I say, is not a therapeutic but an educational problem. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is a bit about what that means in relation to education and health. And I want to just begin by saying that one way that I look at mind-body unity and describing it is to say that any act can never be described as purely physical or purely mental, because every act is psychophysical. So even if I'm swinging a baseball bat, which I have no problem calling a physical act, because it's a lot more physical than reading, is still a psychophysical act. It isn't purely physical. And conversely, if I read, or if I'm just sitting and thinking, I don't just think. I have to use my organism to think, and it's very much a physical process as well as a psychophysical one. And we all know that, because sometimes people who are in deep thought actually will feel the impact. As a writer, I know this. Writing, I find, is one of the most exhausting things that I do. Writing is psychophysical. So an example of this is, well, if actions are psychophysical, that sounds plausible enough, but what do we do with that in practice? How do we interpret that? What does that mean? Well, it doesn't mean very much for most of us, because we don't know. Once someone said to me, well, wait a minute, if action is psychophysical, what can I do about that except I either can meditate for my mind or relax my body? I didn't see that there was any other choice in the matter. And in fact, that seems to be the case. But one thing that mind-body unity means in practice is that we have to actually learn to pay attention and take seriously mundane actions. And that's not something that many of us find, including myself, find very easy. So an example of this is back trouble. Many people find, have lower back pain. It's very ubiquitous these days. And this is, in fact, what got me interested in this field to begin with. And I tried everything in the book to try to deal with it. I tried a whole range of different methods. And it slowly dawned on me that the methods weren't going to solve my problem, because the problem was caused by my own harmful way of doing things. And in even the most innocent, benign sort of actions like walking and sitting, I was shortening my back so badly that it couldn't function well. And I realized that the only way I was going to solve my problem was by learning to identify what that was and prevent it in action. And that actually helped me to begin to solve my problem. But that's not the only meaning of why, removing tension is important, not simply because it makes your back feel better, but because the human upright design, in spite of sometimes the fact that we hear that it's defective and has all kinds of problems attached to it, is actually a remarkable and efficient design. And if we don't interfere with it. So I want to wax philosophical about that just for a second, because this is something we all take so much for granted, the fact that we can stand on 2 feet, if we are able to stand on 2 feet. Because it's not at all obvious or simple how we can manage this feat. The normal view of muscles is that muscles as a tissue are capable of contracting. Muscles are cells that possess the specialized or very specialized ability to contract and to produce movement. But if that's all that muscles did, you could never account for upright posture. Because if you look at a skeleton, apart from the fact that it's held together, all the bones I mean, apart from the fact that it's held together by a bunch of ligaments, the skeleton can't possibly hold itself up against gravity if all muscles did was contract. In fact, if you ponder the question, you might be baffled for a few years, as I was, because it's not so easy to explain how muscles that only contract can actually hold this thing up here like this. And one of the ways they do that is they don't just contract the bones. The bony structure of the skeleton is designed in such a way that the bones, different bones, tend to oppose each other in such a way that they elongate muscles, so that the muscles contract, but they contract in the context of being maintained in a state of stretch by the bones. And when that system is working as it's designed to work, then it could work incredibly efficiently. And the problem is that in humans, it's so complex that we tend to interfere with it. And when we interfere with it, we have to understand more about how it works and be able to restore it, to be able to restore the efficiency of that design. So when we understand how that system works, it becomes possible to do something much more than simply fix or correct a problem, because we can actually establish the healthful conditions on which functioning is based. So I don't really even speak anymore. People sometimes say, well, does your back hurt anymore? And I don't even think in those terms, because I don't feel that my back was cured or healed. I feel that I've been lucky enough to be able to establish a healthy condition of the muscles so that hurting it is no longer an issue. So I want to just show you a couple of slides of children in whom this system is working efficiently. So here you have a little boy who's painting, and I'm sorry to say this, but he's young enough that the system hasn't been interfered with yet by school. So you could see that his upright support system, most of us would see this as posture, but it's far more complex and far more subtle and far more meaningful than posture. But he has very beautiful upright poise, this boy. Here's another one. Here's another boy who is not only, you can not only see how lovely his poise is, but look at his left hand, how lovely that is just on the surface, and his right hand and how delicate. But not only that, his overall attitude is very relaxed and his demeanor is so calm. He has what I would call a very healthy attitude in what he's doing, which is so often, as we know, very different than how kids often are in school. So this is an example of kids who have not interfered with that system. And in contrast, this is what we often see in school. It's not a great photograph, but it captures pretty well how much we can interfere with that system at a young age, often starting around kindergarten. I was discussing this with Lisa, was it yesterday? Kids, when they make the transition from nursery school to kindergarten, they make the transition, I don't know how many of you would corroborate this, we shift from play to work. I mean, I remember the most joyful year that I can remember in my life was 4 years old. And after that, kindergarten was kind of fun, and I don't remember school after that being very much fun, except insofar as I was able to buck the system and have fun in spite of the system, you know? So here's a kid who's beginning to work, and he's interfering with the system. So when you look at this first child, this is how the system is working in him. I just wanted, there's a lot more that I could say about this, but this is sort of an overview of this subject of psychophysical unity. This gives a sense of how the, I have this, can you see this? How all the bony parts are working oppositionally so that the muscles are stretched and maintaining tone in the context of that stretch. So here you see how the head is tipping forward, because that's what the head is. It's balanced in such a way that it would tip forward, as it does in him. You could see the head is lengthening at the end of a long spine. You could see that the spine is long, the muscles at the back are long, the muscles in front are long. His system is working in the way it's naturally designed to work. It's not a question of fixing something, it's a question of understanding how that system works. So that's sort of the first piece of the puzzle here. So there's an even deeper problem. I'll just take that off so we don't keep staring at this boy, because he's better to look at than me. So there's an even deeper problem, which is that if you have, let's say, someone like me who had a tendency to shorten the muscles of the back, and let's say in normal activities, sitting, and you show this person how not to shorten the muscles of the back, which is not so difficult to do in a simple way. And then you say, let's see if we can help you to move in such a way that you don't sort of repeat your old habit and can actually not interfere with the system and maintain the elongated muscles. What will happen is that the moment you even suggest a movement to someone, any kind of movement, they're going to shorten the muscles again. And the reason is that because although we have the conceit that we have voluntary control over our movements, in fact, movement is largely unconscious. And we know this from neuroscience, because if you actually look at what goes into a simple motor act, I mean, very little of it is actually conscious. I mean, we tend to glorify that part of it in a sense, but there's a lot of it that's below consciousness, huge amount of activity. And sometimes what will happen, literally, is that you will actually show someone how to move without tightening their back muscles and say, well, you know, you're having so much trouble with it. Let me show you, let me see if I can vicariously move you in such a way that you'd have the experience of using your back without all that tension. And sometimes the person will literally anticipate your movement and jump out of the chair, literally. I can't show this in a slide because it's very hard to show this visually, so I can only describe it. But what's happening when someone that you want to, let's say, sometimes it could happen with a simple movement like raising someone's arm. You say, let me raise your arm, but I want to see if you can do it without actually holding your arm or stiffening your shoulder. You raise the arm and the person goes like this. And you say, why is that happening? In fact, I puzzled over that years ago when I was learning about this field. Well, this is what William James described as ideomotor action. William James said, you know what? We don't have a will that oversees action, you know, a mind that says, oh, I'm going to order my body what to do, and my body will obey the command. He said action actually takes place in a much more, well, psychophysical way, because we just have ideas throughout the day, and many of them issue into motor acts, many of them in a rather unthinking way. So I just did a little diagram of this. Normally, we think of action in this sense, overseeing will and the motor act, the mind that's above the body and the body that obeys. But in fact, motor acts really occur along a continuum of ideas, some ideas issuing in motor acts and some not. And when we look at it that way, I put time here because it happens over time. It's really continuous. William James had that beautiful concept of stream of consciousness. You know, in his psychology, he said, well, I love that metaphor of consciousness is kind of like a stream. It's always flowing. And here we see that with time, we have ideas as a stream of consciousness flowing into motor acts. And it turns out that that's the real underlying cause of the back problem. What I learned was that even when my back was working better, and I learned how to get the muscles to lengthen and not contract, that this whole system was out of control. And until I was able to bring that system into better control, I really couldn't solve my back problem. So that means that the problem of someone's back is not really a physical problem at all. It's really a psychophysical problem. Except that most of us, although we might pay lip service to that idea, in practice it's not so easy to actually live it and to understand it. And the reason I say that is because, well, as a teacher, I've worked with people for many years helping with problems like this. What happens is someone will say, oh, I believe you, yes, that's true. But the moment their back hurts again, they will, if it's bad enough, they'll go to the doctor because they really not only believe there's something wrong with their back, sometimes they want to believe there's something wrong with their back. Sometimes it gives them comfort to get a diagnosis from the doctor who says, this is what's wrong, and they say, yeah, you see, that's it. And there might be, by the way. There very well might be. But tension, no. If it's tension-related, it probably is not something wrong. And in that case, the real meaning of mind-body unity is to actually come to terms with this and recognize that there's nothing wrong with my back, but what I'm doing to put it wrong in my own unconscious action. And so in a way you could say that the meaning, or part of the meaning of mind-body unity, is to recognize that our own actions are the cause of a problem that we might be suffering from. Again, not all problems, but certain ones. And to take responsibility for that. That's, in a sense, the real meaning of mind-body unity. So notice also that that means that the problem we're looking at is not a clinical problem, it's an educational problem. Because we're not looking at something that needs to be fixed, we're looking at a learning process that we need to undergo. And to understand that problem in children as it's developing, and to recognize, not at the back end when people come to you with problems when they're 30 or 40 or 50, but at the front end when it's developing in children, that's a part of education that we still have not adequately recognized. And this is a problem that John Dewey talked about in depth because he was concerned about the fact that we just didn't take this aspect of child development seriously enough. Because all of the problems we're looking at here are developing in 4- and 5-year-olds. I've even seen this in 2-year-olds. And of course, as you learn about the field, as I have, I've done it for many years, it's a concern. You see kids with sometimes very severe problems that are completely ignored. So, okay, a third area I want to touch on is attention. Not intention, attention. Because attention has received a great deal of attention in recent years clinically. But it's not just a clinical problem. It can be diagnosed as a problem. And I've read some of this literature. And there's some very interesting work being done in the area of clinical diagnosis of attention problems. But attention is not originally a clinical issue. I mean, we all have to learn to be attentive. It's not something that only happens to be a problem in kids with issues. In fact, you could see attention operating as part of this system very early. And I have a bit of a clip. It's very quick. But I want you to see in this infant how attention operates in this infant as part of their movement system working really in a fixed, it's kind of a fixed link. And we all know this. Anyone who's worked with children or had kids knows that at a certain age, at a certain young age, kids have a fixed link between attention and movement. Right? You've ever been holding a young infant and the kid sees something and they'll reach for it even if they fall right out of your arms. And you better catch them because they don't care. They're just reaching. That's because very much like an animal, the interest in something and motor readiness are completely intertwined. So just take a look at this bit. It'll go quickly, and I could run it by again. Oh, there it goes. We wish we could have found, we searched far and wide for this. So what happens in this child, can I back it up and try it again? Will it work? Yeah. Okay. So you could see the moment he caught sight of the dog and is immediately crawling toward the dog. Realizes there's not much to do there, loses interest, comes back. He said, okay, I think what I was doing before was better. I'll come back. So attention is part of this system. Now, when you speak about a very young child, attention is linked with motor acts. But of course, once a kid is getting, well, kind of into school years, now attention becomes more separated from that immediate link with action. Kids can begin to reflect. Part of our job as parents and teachers and educators is to help them reflect and think about what they're doing. But there's still a direct link between attention and motor function. And in some ways, I think precisely because we can separate between thinking, let's say, being interested in something and acting on it, I think precisely because we separate it, we figure there isn't a link, but there is a link because, well, think what happens if you hear a sound and of someone in the house that shouldn't be there. Your whole body is in a state of readiness. Why? Because it's linked. The two are linked. We're attentive for a purpose, for a reason. So what happens in kids who are learning in school, beginning voluntary learning, because that's really, this is instinctive learning, instinctive attention. This kid doesn't choose to be attentive. This kid is instinctively attentive. Kids in school have to utilize more, well, make more effort. They have to, they have to open a book that someone's told them to read. They may not be interested in it. When kids start using voluntary attention to learn a skill, now two things happen to simplify it. Attention becomes interfered with in two kind of directions. The first direction is that a child who's being asked to sit too often in school will get disengaged. And being disengaged is not a good state to be in. I once worked with a 6-year-old child with parents near him, talking with the parents, and his 4-year-old brother running around. And I worked a little with this child, and I said, well, he's really starting to slump, and he's starting to get very heavy in the chair. And the parents said, yeah, we noticed that with kindergarten, and particularly now he was in 1st grade. So I showed them I showed this boy, I said, Mark, can I work with you and show you a little bit about how your body works? And we got him sitting very nicely. And he was sitting in a lovely way, just like this other kid we saw earlier. I was chatting with his parents, and all of a sudden, we saw the kid go into a slump. But what was interesting to me was that the moment he went into a slump, he went like that. He became mentally disengaged. Attention is linked with the motor system, and if the motor system is not actively involved and engaged, we shut down or get distracted. The other extreme, which school tends to cultivate, is that we get overly focused. So here's just a little bit of footage of kids who are getting overly focused in school because, well, I think it speaks for itself. And just take a look at how each kid is. I'm not even sure, but I think someone is speaking to this boy and he doesn't even notice. He's not interested. Was that the end of that bit? Yeah. In this case, we're looking at attention that is being disturbed, but not as a clinical problem. These are normal kids. They don't have any clinically diagnosable attention deficit problems. Attention is disturbed as a function of normal development because our system is very complex and can easily be disrupted. And this is one way it gets disrupted. And kids who are 5 and 6 years old sitting too much, that's another way it gets disrupted. This is why so many of the great educators advocated kids moving a lot till like 7 or so. I mean, didn't Froebel say that, didn't he coin the term kindergarten? And didn't he say that it was play? It was play. That's an unusual concept in those days, how important play was for children. And we're interfering with that, and then we're going to the other extreme of getting kids overly focused so that there's attention disturbances that happen. So attention is not just a clinical problem, it's a normal problem. But precisely because we don't understand that system as a total psychophysical system, we tend to downplay and miss the significance of what that means for all of us. And don't all of us need to learn how to be attentive throughout the lifespan? It's really a major problem. It's mindfulness, really. So this gives us 3 basic elements that you could say constitute psychophysical health. The first one we talked about is the optimal working of the muscular system. The second is the behavioral or ideomotor system. And the third one is quality of attention. I mean, there are other ones that I could add to this, but these are ones that I consider really essential to what I would say constitute psychophysical health in the child or the adult. So this aspect, looking at the system as a total system, is a very different way of looking at things than if you look at physical health alone or mental health or emotional health. Because here we're looking at something, sometimes people think psychophysical unity means it embraces everything, and I don't think it does, actually. I think it's a little dogmatic. Sometimes people say, well, you deal with the mind and body, so anyone with any kind of problem can come to you. Well, not really. I'm not qualified to deal with certain kinds of emotional problems in children. It's not my area, and I don't feel able to deal with it. This is another area that is not the same as emotional or purely mental functioning. This is psychophysical functioning. And we lack a standard for what it is. We lack an understanding of what it is in child development. So this brings me to the question of this subject as a field. Sometimes people will describe this as, they'll say it's sort of somatics or body work. But it isn't, and the reason why it's not body work is because once you describe it as body work, two things happen. The first is that people now, they take out the psychophysical part of it, and once you take out the psychophysical part, the ideomotor part, the fact that the body works always in conjunction with ideas to produce action, now something that's rich and complex collapses back from 3 dimensions back into 2. And you can no longer see attention as part of it. You can no longer really appreciate that it's behavioral and not physical. So I don't subscribe to the view that it's pure somatics or body work, because it isn't. It's a much richer topic than that and a much more important subject than that. And the other problem that happens is that once you describe this as somatics, you're thinking of a method, and once people start thinking in terms of what method can I apply, we start to get rather unintelligent. And we say, wow, I get it. The kids in class are having trouble with this, so can we have a little session every day for half an hour and get the kids running around and paying attention to their bodies? And I would say, how would that address the problem? The problem is part of their actual development in whatever they're doing, and how are we going to address that part of their development if we don't look critically at how this applies to the methods that we use? Because a lot of the methods we use are actually feeding the problem. So a simple example of this is violin. I mean, I've worked with many musicians over the years, because musicians often have to take an interest in this subject. They're in pain, it's threatening their career. So I'll have musicians come to me and say, Ted, can you work with me and help me with my shoulder problem or my back? Well, if a musician is learning this subject as in music school separately from how they learn violin, then you have two things going in opposing directions. Now they're getting their bodies worked on over here and feeling better. But when they actually are playing the violin, they're being asked all the time to rush and approach the problem rather unintelligently. So to me, that isn't looking critically at how this subject intersects with the method. It's not just about the body, it's about how we think of teaching and learning. And this is a subject that John Dewey wrote about in depth in one of his books, where he speaks about the ends and means problem. And he says that we have to learn to achieve our ends intelligently by learning to focus on the means. And to think that we can achieve ends without focusing on the means is kind of superstitious. He uses that word. So we have to look at the subject in terms of methodology. This also applies to the issue of theory and practice, because if we have theory, this is now saying that we really need a theory, not just a practice. We need to understand it theoretically, but we also need to understand the science involved, because it dawned on me, having learned a lot of this in practical ways, I almost learned some of this as an oral tradition, and it dawned on me that as long as that was happening, we weren't going to have adequate science to understand how this really applies to children and how it works as a field. So to really understand this subject, we also need to do science in the field. And the science, at the same time, has to be, in some ways, a new kind of science, because it's a science that involves our awareness of ourselves. And how much and of course, there's a whole new, burgeoning field of neuroscience dealing with that, but a lot of traditional neuroscience does not. A lot of neuroscience is purely descriptive, and we need something more than a descriptive science here. I mean, for instance, we know a lot about how muscles work and how we can, and how motor units, how messages are sent to muscles to tell them what to do. But we need to actually think about how we send the messages to muscles, because it's all about conscious growth and development here. So we need a neuroscience, but we need a neuroscience that's informed by experience as well as by hard science. So together, these areas, the theory and the practice and the neuroscience, and these three areas make up a field, for want of a better word, that my esteemed assistant and colleague, Serena, over here, and I have termed neurodynamics, because it's sort of a dynamic way of looking at the nervous system in action. It's sort of the study of the organism in action. And so, oh, I forgot this. But we'll look at it now. Some of the elements that go into a standard of psychophysical health. When I said that this is not just somatics, well, muscle tone, state of physical poise, our attention level, our mental attitude. Remember, we saw that little boy working in such a lovely way, as opposed to the kids who were like this. Their attitude wasn't so good. And balanced action. These are some of the elements that I would describe as constituting a healthy psychophysical state in a child or an adult. And the field, we call it, again, Lisa said to me, what do you call this? And I said, well, we're coming up with language. We're trying to find language, and here's some of the language we're searching for. So just to look at this, because I'm writing sort of a series of papers just covering some of the neuroscience, but again, it's sort of it's neuroscience, but it's experiential neuroscience as well. One area is the upright support system. This in and of itself is complex, because it deals with muscles and architectural and anatomical design and reflexes. It's really involved right there. This area is really the area where we're talking about how to be aware of muscles, using our thinking process to be aware of and restore normal muscle function when it's been interfered with. And then this is the area where we're talking about how to apply this awareness in action in order to become more conscious in action. And some of those subjects, all together make up some of what I think this field really involves. This is really new, and I've been working on this for many years, but I'm starting to be able to think of this. I think once I woke up and I had a sense of how this worked, and I was able to start writing about it, but I never thought I'd be able to write on these, and slowly it's getting clearer. So I want to just finish by just saying areas that I think this applies to. So one area is health and prevention, which is sort of one of the topics we're talking about here tonight. Not just for kids, but for adults. Another area is child development and learning, because this, to me, should be part of how we assess health in the developing child. Another area is skill and performance, because, well, that alone, I mean, if you're learning a skill and you don't have a command of that instrument, then you're often at a big disadvantage. Some people are able to become very adept at skill and performance without this knowledge, but most people are not. And finally, mindfulness in action, which is really not the topic I'm covering tonight, but really, as a teacher, I've learned over many years that really what you're teaching someone, after all is said and done, because we deal with the body a lot, is you're teaching them to be mindful in whatever they do. And that doesn't apply to kids, obviously, in the same way as it would apply to adults, but there's some continuum there. So these are some of the sort of large areas that this applies to. So that just gives an overview of some of these, this sort of topic of psychophysical unity. We have time for questions, comments.
Great.
Thank you. Humankind is undergoing a huge shift in many, many ways, and one of them is that we've become, well, thank God, we're learning to become freer from scarcity. I think we're capable of being free of scarcity, but we haven't distributed sometimes enough equity. But in the process of all that happening, we're not doing as much physical labor, and we're becoming more and more thinking, more and more focused on technology, and at our own peril, because sitting is one of the most dangerous things we do. As John has commented yesterday about the need to exercise, people who sit should be getting up and moving around. And you can't do that in a car, unfortunately. Otherwise, I'd recommend it. You get up and move. Good. Yeah.
Feel compelled to
Yeah.
walk
Yep.
to wherever.
And also, I like your comment about sitting up, because very often people will tell you with meditation that you can sit and meditate, but you can't sit slumped like this. Why? Because that's not going to be very conducive to being alert. It's much better to sit in a way that's active. I won't claim to be expert in all the other areas, and I don't believe in the exclusivity of one method. I think sometimes people get, as I said earlier, dogmatic about it. I think other models are necessary. I mean, I think the psychodynamic model of emotional health. How could you dispute the importance to a child's development of some kind of psychodynamic theory of health, and isn't that essential to proper development? So I would say that this is in no way inconsistent, that there have to be other elements. So when I say psychophysical, it doesn't mean that it takes into account all the emotional and all the physical. It does by no means does that. But it's just a crucial aspect of what is, I think, needed for a child to maintain health through the lifespan. John Dewey had another way of expressing the idea that I mentioned of William James's ideomotor action, which is, he said that the stimulus-response idea is not really how we function. Really, all the different elements are present at all times, and when we respond to something, we're really just emphasizing different aspects of different functions within the context of a total coordination. And it's a lovely way of putting it, and also that, that kids are responding all the time. It's as if we think they're turned off, and somehow when we teach, now we have to turn them on and inject information in there. You're making me think of the Greek peripatetic school, right? The Greeks who walked, and how do they pronounce it? Yeah, peripatetic. Yeah, they walked. They walked and talked. That's how they did their philosophy. Why not? What's wrong with that? If you're at a computer a lot, get up from the computer when you can. I mean, it's not good to sit at a computer, especially if you don't need to be at it. If you're thinking, as a writer, I've just learned, the moment I'm stuck on something, I get up and walk away. That's what I do. I just walk away from the computer, because I might as well think about it away, first of all, and not stare at the screen. It's good to move. Well, I'm afraid that if we just simply tried to go back to a simpler life, it wouldn't solve it, because life has changed, and I'm a believer. I believe in the change. I think the change is incredible, and we either have to make it work or fail, but I don't think we can go backwards. And it's not going to happen. And in any case, even if we tried, I don't think that would solve this problem. I think we have to learn, my own sense of it is that we have to learn how to raise the use and functioning of this system to a more conscious level. That's not the only thing we need to do for our health. I think if you don't exercise, you're in trouble. I think I think there are other elements that go into being healthy. But learning to use this system seems to me be a crucial piece of it that's been left out. And I don't think we fully appreciate how incredibly miraculous the human system is and how beautifully it's designed to work if we don't interfere with it. And in the Western world, we don't often appreciate that. I mean, much more you'll see in Chinese medicine or Taoist medicine, they'll say that if you do something in an imbalanced way, it's going to have an impact on your health. There's no way around that. So if you're overindulging, that's going to have an impact. We don't tend to appreciate that. That's why moderation is important. And I think that that's something we leave out. We have the idea that I could just push and push and push. And even that is a good thing. But just a couple of thoughts. I do think that if I had stepchildren when they were young we just limited the amount of time. It just was that's my own feeling. People have to make, parents have to make their own decisions. But I think computers are beautiful. The kids should spend time at it. They should have fun doing it. But I think it should be limited. It's too dangerous to let a kid sit at a computer 6 hours a day. It's just too dangerous. So I think, like any technology, it's a kind of form of power. Power is okay. It has to be used for the right reasons and the right ways. And so technology is almost like that to me. It's like a power. It's almost, I have a brother who's a scientist, and he said to me he thinks specifically computer games are dangerous. He said they're addictive in a way that TV could never be, precisely because they're interactive. It leads to a level of addiction. And I get on the subway all the time now, and everyone on the subway is on the thing. And so I think it just limiting it is a very, very big piece of the puzzle for kids, I think. And kicking them out the door and making them play. You know, the movement science program at Columbia is one of the very few education schools anywhere that even has that as part of People have sometimes said to me, well, why aren't you teaching in a medical sphere, or why aren't you I won't, because my field is education. I won't teach anywhere but education. I won't let what I do be medicalized. And that's not to say that there isn't a medical side to the study of movement or sports medicine, et cetera. But the subject of movement and movement science is part of child development, part of education. And this is one of the few places that's even going there. I think for many of us, we're so busy in the mode of doing. I think that sometimes we lose touch with what it means not to do and what it means to sit still. So I start my day, every day, I start doing nothing. I have tea, I have a bite to eat, and I do nothing. And when I've stopped, I start my day. You know, I don't start my day by riling myself up by doing things. In fact, and writing even more so. I know people, I admire people who can write when they get up first thing. But if I write at 8 in the morning for 2 hours, I'm completely burned out for the rest of the day. So I almost never, when I'm writing, I tend to start later in the day. And anyway, I think that the idea of being able to stop and be comfortable with stopping. Who is it? Was it Pascal or someone who said, no one's happy in an empty room? Someone said something like, this is hard for people, but I think that that's part of learning to be content, is to be able to stop. That's part of what this work that I teach is about, stopping. The idiomotor, learning how to stop and to know what that means and to actually learn it as a principle in living, this is very difficult, very, very difficult.
Well, we may have arrived at the point where we should stop.
Oh.
Let's thank Ted Dimon for
Thank you. Thank you.